Hello, hello, hello. It's your boy Wild Philosopher here with Ryan Rose to remind you that fairies are real. And today we are going to be finishing our deep dive on fairies. Woohoo! We're going to start with a quick overview of what we talked about last week for those who didn't listen in or maybe are joining us now for the first time. Save you guys, what was it, 2 hours, 10 minutes, an hour and 40 minutes? We went a while.
Yeah.
We went a while last week. Yeah, save you guys a lengthy discussion on what is a fairy. Or last week we mostly focused on listing the various features associated with fairy encounters, i.e. in Memorits, which, those who need a quick refresher, are records of putative or ostensive encounters with real beings, as opposed to literary stories, in the same way that we would regard stories about Charles Dickens' life as being in a different category from the stories about Ebenezer Scrooge. So we went over what are the features of fairies in those encounters. We briefly explained what things we can exclusively rule out from the category of fairy. We did not, however, have time to elaborate a formal theory of just what a fairy is. Did I say formal fairy of what a fairy? Formal theory?
Right.
Yeah, formal. It's okay. Fairies are theories. Theories are fairies. This is the root of all virtue. Follow me for more ancient wisdom. All right. We're going to start with our discussion of what were the features we sort of linked to a fairy?
I'd say, there's their values: honor, nobility, keeping your dues, chivalric values, their ties to aristocracy, their relation to keeping the word and being committal, their association with music, dancing, bright colors, their, proximity to derelict sites or sites on the periphery of human civilization, their special association with children and the childlike heart, their association with the landscape, mounds, trees, rivers, more generally bodies of water, mountains even. I think we went over their aesthetic, or their association with aesthetics.
Yes.
Their ability to craft things, things of that are higher than, or the craft things that are much more just generally better than what humans can do. Peerless artisans.
Yeah, we have a question from the audience.
Okay.
Are elves fairies?
We would categorize. You could categorize an elf as a fairy, because an elf. That is. Typically in scholarship, it carries a sort of nebulous concept, but in function, I would say they are, because of their close proximity. One, they inhabit in the Norse cosmology, kind of an other world space that you'd call Alfheim. And typically that space is usually associated with the typical features of fairy space, which is mounds and what have you. In popular Norse consciousness, fairies were associated with mounds, but they were also associated with trees and with bodies of water. And they share that affinity with dwarves, which are more or less in the same category. So yes, we would categorize them as a fairy.
Yeah. I guess maybe to clarify, there's two senses in which you can use the word fairy. There's the narrow sense, which will apply only to the group of Irish beings called the fairies. And then there's the broader, more the broader sense, which we would simply use to categorize beings of a similar kind.
Yes.
So in an Irish context, of course, I think it might almost best to think of. There's a term in academia called oikotypes, which is a fancy way of saying home type, like typology based on home, and this just connotes the way the same concept changes depending on regional identity.
Yeah.
So you'll often see notions echoing across cultures or religions with minute changes. Fairy to elf is one.
Yeah.
But yeah. Why are fairies so feared, and why are they quick to anger?
Well, that's a good question. I think we went over that last time. Part of the reason they're feared, I think, is due to the fact they're misunderstood, and not in a tropey, oh my gosh, you're so misunderstood. Like, they're misunderstood because fairies, when they do, so the reason they're aggressive or they're quick to anger is that in folklore you do see this notion in which a fairy, in proximity to a community, might react to that community's standards or their own, I guess, moral or rather immoral inclinations, and that darkness can actually reflect in the fairy. So they react to their environment, and specifically human habits, which
Yeah.
if the humans start becoming, if the humans in the environment start becoming more, I don't know, just not good-hearted, the fairy will act accordingly.
Well, I think it's a question of accidents of survival, right? What does folklore pass down to us? It's not going to pass down the many mundane stories in which nothing all that impressive happens, right?
Yeah.
Same with if you want to talk about like lore about angels, or if you believe in saint interventions, right? Or the God himself, like we're there. Everyone who has been to a church can hear dozens of stories from the people who go there about like very minor. I don't want to quite call them miracles, but like I pray, I prayed. We were, I don't know, supposed to have the family barbecue, and then there were 5 straight days of rain because we were hit by a typhoon, and I prayed, and just before the barbecue, the typhoon passed or whatever. I've heard dozens and dozens of variations on this with like minor wounds, events. I've even witnessed it a few times. Somebody told, I always remember it was like pouring rain, and somebody was like, "Oh, we got the barbecue in 5 hours," and the religious head of the institute is like, "Don't worry, it never rains at the barbecue." And sure enough, the rain cleared half an hour before the barbecue. And they're like, "See," but stuff like that does not tend to get passed down generationally, right?
Yeah, I agree.
It's brief anecdotes. Like I tell it to you guys. You guys are not going to pass this to your kids. You're going to pass it to your relatives. It's a quick story. I told it in 30 seconds about the time it stopped raining because that was conducive to the religious center's barbecue. Whereas stories about the stories that have a deep emotional impact are the ones we're likely to tell and pass on. But those are disproportionately going to be stories involving violence, fear, terror, hatred. Same with stories about humans. Like you will notice when I look at, like, the average medieval peasant did not spend all his time dying in brutal, bloody wars. He didn't even spend most of his time starving or like dying to the plague or any of the other stuff that you get in Hollywood. The average medieval peasant spent all his time doing a large variety of activities ranging from like farming to dancing at local festivals, like dating his wife. A lot of them were in fact literate. They would go to folklore conventions. They was storytelling. They had very complex lives, not our lives, but very complex lives. But how do we remember it? We collapse the whole Middle Ages down into like war and plagues. Right? Even though there were only a few really major plagues in like 1,000 years, those are the ones that have persisted in the human consciousness. Similar to, we talk about, like, if I bring up the 18th century, you guys are probably going to bring up the American Revolution. Maybe if you're a little more historically conscious, you'll bring up, like, the War of Jenkins' Ear. You're probably not going to bring up the many decades that people just spent not fighting. So I'm not, like, I do think there is fear around fairies. I also think that is at least partially an accident, and accidents of survival are instances where our historical vision can get skewed because of certain materials are more likely to survive. It's like, why do we have no nursery rhymes from late antique Greece? We know people told them because they're mentioned in Tertullian, for instance. But obviously the answer is because it cost a bloody crap ton of money to handwrite stuff on like ink in ancient Greece, and nobody was going to do that with nursery rhymes. And thus we lost all of the nursery rhymes told in ancient Greece, thereby depriving us of many wonderful, but we know they were there, like Tertullian mentions them. I even have a 3,800-year-old Sumerian nursery rhyme threatening the child with wrath from the angry bull god if he doesn't go to sleep right this minute. Some human concerns have not changed. It's like, I remember it off the top of my head. I'd have to go pull it out, but it's like, hush little. The thrust of it is like, hush little baby, don't say a word, or the angry bull god is going to beat you up because he'll be like, why'd you wake me up, child? Academics filed it as a magical incantation to put children to sleep. It's like, yeah, magical incantation indeed. But yeah, I think it's partially an accident of survival. There are enough memories passed down from fairy lore, and especially if you look at the more recent stuff, where increased literacy and increased interest in these sorts of issues has enabled us to take much broader records.
Mm-hmm.
You will notice there are wide varieties of records in which there is no fear, but like curiosity or shock. I also think part of it is just fear of not to be fear of the unknown.
Yeah.
If you look at Loch Ness Monster encounters, for instance, the earliest ones many of them were on land, right? And the Loch Ness Monster is seen typically at night, and it's like people are terrified. But this isn't because the Loch Ness Monster is a fearful creature. This is because you're taking a walk at 11 p.m. at night, and all of a sudden a 20-ton, 20-foot or 20 to 60-foot long gray monster barrels out of the woods in front of your back. I would be pretty scared myself, even if whether we think it's like some sort of magical being or a giant lizard, or even just them being really confused about. What was the one? I think, herd of deer was the skeptical explanation for that one.
A herd of deer.
Oh, yes. It was one he saw it as one animal, but it was a herd of deer, guys. It was a herd of deer. And then the quick to anger is, it's partially a survival issue. The stories in which you, dropped something on a fairy's foot and he went, oh, my bad, because he was just too near you, are not the sort of stories that get passed down for hundreds of years. Part of this is the role, like they're sort of they're proximal beings or liminal, near human settlement, and they tend to react both to the darkness or not lack of good-heartedness in human culture, and also to what they see as hypocrisy.
Oh yes,
we mentioned in our last stream a large number of stories involved. I mean, the majority of lore involving fairies involves brief encounters with your house, the fairy of the house or the house spirit. But I think the next biggest one after that is going to be, we were all supposed to be at church, but I decided to go out and play, and then Tinkly Winks, the magical pixie, kicked me in the balls repeatedly until I went to church. That is like variations on that are an astonishing number of fairy stories. Like, I was in charge of keeping the kitchen clean, but I was dumping dirty water behind the stove, so he tied me to the ceiling rafter.
Don't piss off Tinkly Winks.
He pissed off Tinkly Winks. Yeah. Usually, often, like, I mean, yeah, I say Tinkle. Invisible forces. Cape Horseman, like I mentioned, there's a wide variety. It used to be commonplace to gather nuts, and for those of you who have ever gathered nuts or fruit, you know there's often it depends on the fruit, of course. Apples, you have a broad window. A lot of nuts, you don't have a broad window. Which means sometimes the nuts are ripe at the same time that it's a holiday, and so there are stories where people, they didn't want to go to the holiday, they wanted to spend their time collecting and eating nuts instead, or blackberries, and then while they're out, they are chased or beaten or watched creepily by weird dogs or mounted riders. And of course, in practical terms, the thrust of these stories is so go to church, which is like, take what we call boogeyman tales. But the thrust in terms of the belief of or what these indicate about the fairies per se is it's the violation of the norm that angers them, because the individual ostensibly adheres to this value, like they'd be upset. I mean, what was the C.S. Lewis's, the one thing that always bothers us about hypocrisy is when we see it from other people. I can't remember when he said that. I want to say it was either the abolition of man or mere Christianity. Probably his best quote, eh? It's like, we espouse these values, we hold other people to these values, but we don't hold ourselves to these values. And that is what tends, in folklore, that's what tends to really drive the fairies nuts. Not because they care so much about whether or not you're harvesting nuts on a Sunday, but because of the violation of your own values. For an analog to, I guess, more mundane existence, consider the fact that we all, like, if you have two neighbors, one who is, charity is very important, like let's say he's religious, he places a premium on charity, he talks about charity all the time, and the other one is a hardline, misanthropic egoist who asserts that the only end in life is to make yourself wealthy, and if the poor starve, that's their own dying fault for not working hard enough. Which of the two are you going to be madder at if he doesn't give money to charity? Right, it'll be the first guy. And this.
No, I'm just agreeing.
Yeah. It's which isn't to say the second guy isn't living a morally wrong life, but these are. You can think of these like first and second order virtues. Honesty and integrity are second order virtues because they tend to buttress other virtues.
Yeah.
So we need, having integrity is not enough to make you a good person, because you can have integrity for a terrible value system. By the same token, having a good value system and no integrity also doesn't make you a good person. So integrity is a virtue that it's at its best when it's combined with a good series of values, such as not pointing and laughing while poor people starve.
Yeah.
And so there's not even stories about misanthropes and fairies, because misanthropes don't even merit seeing a fairy. Fairy just has nothing to say to them. But yeah, that was a bit of a digression there. I think that about covers it, though, eh? For that question.
Yeah, I think that was a pretty heavy answer. So yeah.
Yeah. So I guess a list of values. Music and dance, liminal spaces, very aristocratic, like honor. Questions of honor and the value of one's word tend to be central to fairies. Issues of cleanliness, order, purity, social order, paying your debts, and then otherwise, they tend to be liminal beings. So that was the list of things to roughly finish off what Ryan said earlier that we can associate with fairies. And next, we're just going to quickly recap what isn't a fairy. What a fairy is not, which again we talked about last week.
Oh, Rorni has a question.
Can I give some examples of fairy lore where fairies lead people to bury treasure? I'm going to guess you want me to not talk about grimoires.
Please, God, no.
Oh yeah, we won't talk about grimoires. There are so okay, real quick. A grimoire is just a collection of magical advice. The demonic side of the grimoire is the most well known because it's the most lurid. You can also, however, there's also all sorts of stuff involving angels, magic gems, fairies. There is a lot of stuff involving fairies and treasure finding. Obviously, a grimoire is going to be not reliable for the two people who just left. Mostly because it's a work of, a lot of it is advertising. I know this sounds really, you look at a grimoire, it's like, a lot of the grimoires that have been passed down to us are full of absolutely fantastical claims. Like, do this and you'll become fabulously wealthy and live hundreds of years. Examples of fairy lore where fairies lead. I will pointedly not talk about Joseph Smith. Pointedly not talk about Joseph. The famous, for those who don't know, Joseph Smith's private diaries. This is that Joseph Smith, yes, the founder of the Church of Latter-day Saints, as they prefer to be called. His private diaries indicate that he was engaged in invoking Native American treasure spirits to lead him to buried treasure when he found what are they called? The famous gold plates of Mordor. They are called the golden plates. Yeah, the golden plates. Yeah. So that would probably be the most infamous anecdote of a fairy leading someone to treasure. There's a much less infamous, but in some respects equally hilarious one in the Chinese classic of tea, where a very hairy fairy, probably some sort of wild man called Yeren in China, leads a Taoist. I want to say it was a Taoist. It could have been it could have been a scholar in Confucian. Not a huge. For all we make distinctions theoretically, in practical terms, they were often the same people. This guy's walking in the woods when he meets this fairy, and the fairy, who knows this guy loves tea, leads him to a very rare strain of tea growing wild in the backwoods. Which I know sounds weird. Like, you're talking about treasure. For those of you who love, rare teas were worth their weight in gold. They were absolutely worth their weight in gold, especially back then.
There are also examples of certain memorits and Soggins, in which, in exchange for a deed well done, fairies will grant the person some treasure, which can be in the form of gold, silver, or precious gems.
Or special abilities.
That too.
Wasn't there one about that in the Lun Nama book?
I don't remember.
I can't. That one may have been. There was a famous anecdote. They're identified as trolls, which doesn't mean like troll can mean either giant or fairy depending on context.
And the era.
And the era, yes, depending context, era, etc. There's an anecdote in the Land Nama book, which is the history of the settlement of Iceland, where I want to say it's by mistake. I want to say he's taking shelter from a storm, and he hears two trolls talking about where they buried their treasure.
The leprechaun is a good example of this too, actually.
Yeah, Leprechaun's an amazing example. If you look up leprechauns, you'll often find weird, unfounded claims that the leprechaun is some really recent. What is it? What do they think? They think it's some like immortalized image, like English image of an Irishman. It was something really silly.
I haven't seen that one.
Oh, okay, like some racial Irish memory or something. Anywho, leprechaun is actually one of the oldest, or Lupercan, as it used to be called in the older sources. The oldest reference to him, I want to say the oldest is the Black Book of Carmarthen. But I think 7th or 8th century is. This will be, your citation here is going to be Claude Lecouteux, The Hidden History of Elves and Dwarves.
Yeah.
It might not have been. I don't think it's the Black Book of Carmarthen, because I think that's 12th century. But leprechauns from the earliest time period are associated with treasure finding.
Yeah.
In connection to their sort of chthonic, watery spirits, and then they get associated with shamrocks at a presumably later date. So yeah, I can't, off the top of my head, I cannot think of any other like physical buried treasure. A lot of stuff involving.
I think there are a few trials in the Renaissance that reflected this. Like which trials?
I want to say there were, but I think a lot of those involved grimoire stuff.
No, not all of them.
Oh.
No.
Yeah. Okay. If you can remember any,
I'll try to go look for the source.
Yeah. If you can remember any. I have not seen that one. I have seen, like, if we're talking in a treasure in a broader sense, like in the most narrow sense, treasure means money, right? Or stuff that can be turned into money. If we're talking about treasure in a broader sense, a more inclusive one that might have old, say, sources of healing, like medical info, information about where to find certain foodstuffs, information about how to grow certain foodstuffs, then yeah, that's going to show up extensively in witch trials, especially in the area involved, like northern Italy and the areas in like the surrounding areas in South France, Switzerland, parts of Austria, where you had very extensive relationships between peasantry and what were all but certainly fairy visitations. And they would often give you like things that are not monetarily valuable, but would be an absolute like priceless treasure to the average 13th, 14th century peasant. Nicholas of Cusa complains about this in, I want to say it's a private letter. This is recorded in Carlo Ginzburg, Ecstasies Deciphering the Witch's Sabbath, where Nicholas of Cusa mentions that several members of his congregation had informed him that they'd been receiving information on healing practices from Hairy Woman, and Cusa lectured them that they should be more concerned with the healing balm of Christ. Another famous example would be the physicians of Midfi. They claimed to have received their info from a fairy who'd married into the family. And that one's recorded in, is it the Red Book of Helgast? I am totally misremembering the name here. But yeah. Yeah, Red Book of, or Physicians of Midfi. And again, maybe not a physical treasure, but still, I mean, you can always make more money, but you can't get your health back. Unless you believe in Taoist miracle working. In which case you can make more money and get your health back. So yeah, Ryan, are you still there, or are you digging through your stuff?
I'm here.
Okay. All right. I think we've about covered the questions, and we can proceed into like what a fairy is not.
Yeah.
Again, just a quick recap. I think we can gloss over the stuff that they're obviously not, like elementals. There's just no evidence that there's a unique elemental influence, especially given that very little of fairy lore even has to do with physical scientific theories of that nature.
Yeah.
Not a racial memory. I don't know how to break it to those who don't think of that one.
Well, that one I think is in the middle of getting, getting booted out right now, because I just saw some recent examples of the pixie picked hypothesis just collapsing on etymological grounds. Like, did you know that one? Like, the pixies are a memory of the Picts.
No, that seems obviously ridiculous.
Oh, it is.
Yeah.
But they tried to connect it on etymological, and that collapsed.
Yeah.
Like,
I mean, yeah. To be fair to them, that's going to be a difference in approach, right? We're comparativists on this channel.
Yeah.
For us, weird, flimsy etymological arguments hold no water because we're looking at 40, 50, 60 different varieties of the exact same being recounted by dozens of different cultures who had never encountered Picts. Whereas, well, just to explain for the audience, whereas a lot of times you see theories like this, it's from people with a very narrow, they tend to have a much more focused area of expertise, and that's not necessarily. I'm not saying this critically, because you owe breadth and depth. Like you can sort of have both. You just have to sacrifice one when you get the other, right? Which means that in order to do comparative scholarship, we can't deep dive as much into like issues of Pictish climatology in the 2nd century. So yeah, I think that one I think is totally. I think there's a few academic holdfasts. It's probably more popular in online spheres.
I would say yes.
Yeah, especially with the Guido von List types.
Well, nowadays, like white identitarian groups are going to lean more on that argument for propaganda purposes.
Yeah, well, that was List's, or it was partially List's view. He has some very interesting speculations on this.
Yeah.
I guess on that point we can clear out euhemerized gods.
Obviously,
they're not. Yeah, there's just no evidence. No, like the typology that traces out for fairy in Christian Europe also traces out for fairy in, not just in other monotheistic regions like is the Islamic world. It traces out in regions that had never heard of monotheism or were entirely polytheistic. So there's no reason to infer that fairies as a whole are euhemerized gods. And in practice, what we find is often the opposite. Or it goes all over. Like, a lot of the time, people are turning deities into human beings. Sometimes they're turning human beings into deities. Sometimes they're even turning... A lot of the stuff that fairies are gods was actually started by Christian polemicists in the 13th, 14th, especially the 17th century, though. Early Protestants were hell-bent on their Catholic Church as a vestige of paganism view, which is no longer socially... I mean, it's no longer acceptable in most sensible Protestant circles to assert that. But at the time, that was a major argument, and to buttress that argument, it often involved reinterpreting fairies as gods. The most famous example being the leader of the Wild Hunt magically becoming Odin for the first time. There's six... Yeah, well, that was Le Couteau's point in Phantom Armies of the Night, that there's at least 600 years in which the Wild Hunt is recounted and testified across a dozen different regions in Europe. The figure shows up in very similar forms in India and Japan. In no cases was he a god, and then it's only for the very first time in Protestant polemicists where you see, like, the Catholic Church has permitted the peasantry to worship the Wild Hunt led by Odin. With the main target being Christmas celebrations, for the record. So yeah, like, Wild Hunt wasn't led by Odin. I don't know who, just in case anyone was wondering. It was a very much involved with fairy lore, and so we often find there was more the opposite that was the case. We taste racial memories. The dead, again, another academic theory, largely.
That's just due to bad metaphysics.
It's just due to bad metaphysics and weird comparisons. We were mounds are all funeral mounds, and then when they show up in the house, it's because they're ancestor spirits. To be very clear, like, a lot of this also will sometimes involve aggressively conflating the two in places where ancestor spirits exist. Usually it's just theorized. But even in places where ancestors do exist, they're often seen as distinct.
Yeah, that's true in the case of the Philippines. They actually have a special linguistic, they have a special, especially distinct category for ancestors, which has its own terms, and they separate those from the more ostensibly fairy-like beings, which they call the Diwata, which were just never human.
Yeah. China's the same, right?
Mm-hmm.
There is basically no evidence of conflation between ancestor spirits and like all the various, fairy maidens and dragons and weird spiritual beings like Old Man Yellowstone floating around in the Chinese spirit world.
Yeah. This is also the case for Native Americans as well.
Yeah.
A lot of times it's like actually little people, and they weren't our ancestors.
I think the only thing that might correspond is both get tied into feng shui. But even then, it's in very different spheres. It's like if the feng shui of your ancestor's tomb isn't appropriate, you might find yourself with misfortune. But that's not because of fairies. That's because of your ancestor. And likewise, it's not like your ancestor. If the feng shui of your nearby, I don't know, rice farm is inappropriate, your ancestor is not going to have any impact there. Whereas the spirit of grain and water might. Nature spirit, again, I think same as gods. You'll notice from our earlier list of features associated with fairies, there's certainly relations to elements of nature with individual fairies or individual kinds. To equate fairies with the processes of nature as a whole is a dubious metaphysical falsehood, largely propounded by New Age groups.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem to have existed before. Like fairies, I think, and part of the problem here is the idea of nature that we inherit in the West is not, whether or not it's right, it's not universal. People's different cultures and different religions many have rejected the existence of nature. The Sumerians, for instance, who also had a fairy typology, were firmly separated the external world into two spheres, heaven and earth, and then broke it down between the wilds and civilization, more so in their later stage. But they did not, in either event, have some sort of nature which was associated with the spirit world. Same goes for medieval Europe. Nature as a concept really starts to rumble in the 12th century, but even then it remains as a sort of backdrop, largely with mostly Aristotelian connotations, until it takes its current form in the 18th and 19th century. Which isn't to say anything about whether or not nature exists, to be very clear. It's merely to say that fairies cannot really be associated with nature in the folklore, because that would be anachronistic.
Mm-hmm.
Whether there is such a thing as nature or not. People just can't associate fairies with ideas they don't have. And then the last two, I guess, that we were going to discuss, and we're going to keep recapitulating them as we begin into our discussion of what fairies are, will be demons and New Age aliens. Or entities of light are the other one that you'll get a lot of the time in New Age. So to be clear, these are not things that our fairies are. But if any of you ever open up New Age books, you'll see a lot of stuff about beings of light. If they're not busy declaring that fairies are nature spirits, they will often declare that fairies are beings of light. Do you know where that belief comes from?
I just thought they associated their own light beings with fairies just after the fact.
Yeah, that would make more sense.
Yeah, like Interpretatio New Ageico. I don't know.
Interpretatio Aquarii. Yeah. And you will encounter this all the time. It's a collection of New Age beliefs. To be clear, if there's any New Age thinkers listening, or anyone who sort of adheres to New Age values listening to this discussion, this is not meant to be a critical discussion of New Age views as much as it is to be a critical discussion of some New Age categories. And again, I think you can separate the two, not in the sense that I think the core beliefs of what it means to be a New Ager, at its best, are not necessarily things that involve equating gnomes with beings of light. It's not all that hard. Like, if you want to, beings of light are not personally something I believe in, but if you want to believe in them, you can without equating them with fairies. Is the only point I want to make. And you can even have a positive view of fairies without thinking that they're beings of light. A bit of a shocker, that one. But anywho, fairies as demons, certainly the most well-known equivocation. Basically, false, not just in empirical terms, but also for as respecting fairies, but also as respects what it means to truly be demonic. If we examine the scriptures and examine questions of salvation and angelification and demonification, and look at demons and create a respective typology for what it means to be a demon, what we will have is a list of categories that do not interplay with fairies in 90% of 90, 95, maybe even 98% of circumstances. This includes, like malignant and harmful behaviors, antisocial tendencies, a contempt for order, pride, and then as respects like their most infamous attitude, when the courting human beings, usually they are trying to encourage, if we accept that piece of the folklore, negative traits that people might actually be willing to accept or be proud of. Piety is probably the biggest, right? I'm such a pious.
Nope. Yeah.
Well, yeah. Like the number, as weird as it might sound to those who, it's like, why would demons want to encourage piety? The more you think you're a pious person, right, the more proud and arrogant and divorced from God you are.
Yeah.
Like, oh, I'm so humble, I'm so proud, I have so much integrity. And they're going to create the sensation that you already have achieved these things, and therefore that you need not wrangle with the fact that you haven't. So, and you can see a clear-cut split here between this sort of demonic behavior and sort of fairy behavior, where their only concern is if you're not doing this, in which case they're going to show up and, I don't know, kick you in the knees until you start doing it, and tie your hair into knots to the bed frame. But even then, your virtues are not there. Well, I will pause there. And then aliens. Aliens are interesting. We're probably going to do a separate discussion about aliens.
Well, there's two ways you could approach that, right? There's aliens in the general sense. Oh, maybe they're from another planet and whatever. And then there's aliens in the, let's say, modern Western American Anglosphere folkloric sense, like related to the alien encounter, contactee, abduction phenomenon.
Yeah.
So, the latter one, well, go ahead, approach it however you want.
No, you can. If you had anything you wanted to say, much more about aliens than I do.
Yeah, so I guess in the general sense, like people from another planet, it's kind of again that's a modern rationalization of the folklore, to appeal to our kind of modern senses or ideas of otherworldly beings. Because again, it's not like you can make rough analogies, and it's not as if they're not analogous. But the question is, do they reflect an actual notion of, like, say, aliens that evolved on another planet, kind of use and cultivate technology for their own ends, and then kind of use that technology to, I don't know, travel space through our physical dimension. I would say no. That is not what the folklore reflects. It's much more like transcendental. It is meant, like, implied to be that way.
Yeah, most of the folklore involves, like, they're not actually coming from outer space. In the vast majority of cases, they're coming from bodies of water, and then secondarily from like mountains.
Well, I mean, just all different. Like, they come from trees, mountains, mounds, water. Like that's. So they are associated with the earth, actually, in some capacity.
Yeah.
Could say, like, I guess, I mean, it's also the fact that they inhabit an other world. So they do inhabit a plane. We'll call it, I won't say dimension, because that's chock full of certain assumptions, and it's just wrong in a scientific sense. But I guess the modern academics would use plane of existence. So they aren't on the earthly plane of existence, but they are associated with it or associated with it in some capacity, but they do have their own place of origin that is outside of that as well.
Yeah. And then there's no evidence of actual complex craft. This isn't to dismiss the potential of aliens per se, but the craft in question are all like the main craft associated with them is a piece of human technology from the 30s that can the Schauberger watercraft even fly?
I don't know.
Yeah, like it's a water propelled jet. Basically, that's supposed to fly in the air. I don't know if it actually functions or not, but suffice it to say it is not profound interdimensional technology. Fairy aliens themselves broadly do not meet the criteria we laid out for fairies.
Only in a superficial sense.
They look superficially like it. It's like, oh, they have pointy ears. Actually, sorry, that's not in there. But like, oh, they look a bit like elves. And there's weird glowing lights, which I mean, people have associated weird glowing lights with everything. And they give you, I don't know, benefits, but they don't really. They just say they'll give you benefits. Which again, like fairies, typology of honor mostly.
Yeah.
They don't say they're going to give you they're going to give you stuff. They give you stuff, or they don't give you stuff. In which case, they just don't say they're going to give you stuff. And if they do say they like, we talk about performative language in philosophy. Performative language. So you guys have probably heard perform. It's usually used in a negative sense, where somebody says they'll do something and they won't, and then they don't. He's just saying that performatively, right? It's like we should give all our money to the poor, he said, and gave nothing to the poor. It was but a performative statement in philosophy means a statement that implies action.
Mm-hmm.
Right. If I say, I will take out the trash, that is a performative statement because I have said I will take out the trash. Right. It implies an action, the act of taking out trash. If I then take out trash, I fulfilled my performative action. If I don't take out trash, that would be where performativity is used in a negative sense. When a fairy says he'll do something, he does it. So, with that in mind, we did establish that fairies are numinous beings, right? They're not your ancestors. They're not, there's just no real evidence linking them to spacecraft, so probably not technology. Numinous beings. Not a god, but a numinous being. In the same way that, say, like angels, demons, gods, all numinous, in very different ways.
Yeah.
That's
they're
one
part of that order, but they're distinct.
Yeah, they have a distinct role. Feature 2, so that's feature 1. Numinous being, not divine. Right, it's not a deus.
Yeah.
When you see the two being conflated in various religions, it's usually by religions that are it's usually just the word spirit, right?
Yeah.
Like Shen.
Well, actually, yeah. In the Philippines, they use ancestral terms to describe fairies, like the little mound dwarf with the little mushroom hat. But it is acknowledged as not being an ancestor, and that's only said out of respect.
Oh no, I just mean in China it'll often all just be called Shen, right?
Yeah,
but Shen just means spirit.
I'm just using an example.
Yeah.
Like you have to actually be careful with the terminology and not just be like, oh, it's an ancestor.
Yeah.
And then I just equivocate and shit the bed.
Well, Yeah, this was an issue actually with the reception of Christianity into China, because some early Christians were insisting on translating God as Shen,
Oh, okay.
which Shen just means spirit, right?
Yeah.
The way when people talk about folk religion, they call it Shen Dao. Some of you may recognize the Japanese rendering of that, Shinto. Just like way of spirits in Chinese, and then rendered into Japanese. The way, so it does not have any. I mean, it has definite meaning, but it does not have it. It does not allow you to capture the shades of disparity between God Most High, Apollo, Satan, Michael, and Tiddlywinks the Pixie. That would be an epic Marvel lineup, eh?
Oh man.
Jesus, Satan, Michael, and Tiddlywink, Apollo, and Tiddlywinks the Pixie all taking on.
Also, Lamphorius the Ascendant brother.
So, it's such a ridiculous.
From Lemuria.
Then you'll get everyone gets so accidental blasphemy. They're all saying, maybe remove God from the equation, and it's just they're all setting out to clear their name of all being Satan. Oh man, that would be a risque one. Anywho, and other one is fairies are very somatic, which means embody is a fancy schmancy way of saying embodied, as opposed to like sometimes imagined as ethereal. Certainly, I think graceful would be correct, but it would be a mistake to see fairy encounters as in some sense not in purely immaterial or non-physical. Not different type of say what it means to be physical from encountering an animal, but the folklore certainly depicts them as physical.
Yeah, like you can touch one, you can hold one, you can draw blood from it, and there are reports of them leaving behind blood remains.
Yeah.
After a battle. So the question as to regarding empirical study is kind of interesting, but we won't get into that.
Well, that does establish that fairies are not the Loch Ness monster.
Oh,
I know that. I'm just waiting for academics to come up with that one. But yeah, when you shoot the Loch Ness monster, he turns into gelatinous ooze. It's still my favorite fact to throw at people who think he's a plesiosaur. I don't know why it's a real, like, people have attacked the Loch Ness monster numerous times, or related lake monsters in Scotland and Ireland, and whenever they shoot it or blow it up, there's just weird ooze everywhere. It's like, okay then.
What if you turn that into a paste?
Yeah, folklore is certainly something. It's certainly something.
Yeah.
Very, very definitely never a boring afternoon reading about people blasting the Loch Ness monster. I think it was 14 casks of quicklime to see what happened. And then it flew, and we saw a large black shape fly into the air. It's like, okay, I love you, folklore. But yeah, so numinous being, that was thing one, but not divine. Number two, somatic but different type of physicality from an animal. Number three, proximal to fortune, bounty, and healing.
Yeah.
There is a definite relationship between fairies and treasure in the broad sense, right? Not like just piles and piles of money, but
although, yeah, sometimes
Sometimes, yeah, but I think more so between fairies and
yeah. Well, it depends on what your community values, I guess.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, but usually lore that's beneficial to people's health
Yes.
and well-being. We've established, beings of honor here with reliable actions and oaths. That's thing 4. I don't think we have to go over that again.
Yep.
Because that kept coming up and up and up and up and up.
I
If
mean, I
any of
think
you,
we've gone over most of the stuff on what they are, or sorry, what they aren't. I guess we could talk about what we think are. I mean, we've been kind of doing that most of the night, but what they are.
yeah,
I guess,
well,
yeah. Oh, you continue.
I was just, the two sort of interrelate, right?
Yeah.
This is one of the critiques of apophatic theology, is in saying what God isn't, you're still making an implicit claim about what he is.
Yes.
But yeah, beings weak. I guess we can establish. Yeah, like we mentioned, if we're talking about honor, honor can be subdivided in the West into 2 approaches. Or for those of you who were listening to my stream with Matt, I want to say a week or 2 ago, you'll notice we talked extensively. Yeah, the trendification of reality and the end of the ordinary. You'll see I shuffle and I talk about Junji. Junji, 4th century Confucian thinker, engaged extensively with religious eschatology, issues of phenomenology, questions of ritual. Best known for his view that human beings are evil. It's like the musical John Calvin. Famously talked about honor and established that the honor of appearances is not honor. It's just shallow arrogance. Honor is questions of like virtue. What makes someone honorable is living up to their virtues. And so that maybe is the type of honor that we can associate with fairies. It's not a concern about their appearance, which they can change at will and will often pick, like they'll show up as animals, piles of bones,
Feathers.
Ugly, yeah, really ugly creatures, wolves.
But they do have a true form.
Yeah, they do. Yeah, not fully protean, but not quite as vain as some sources would portray them. But the honor they're testing you on is that of your character. It's not that of how well you can make yourself look. Questions of face. Put this in practical terms, like, man, you have 2 politicians. The first politician embezzles money through a NGO. Let's say he establishes the Let's Stop Puppy Kicking NGO, to pick a politically non-controversial example. Maybe I shouldn't assume it's non-controversial not to kick puppies, but he says establishes the Let's Not Kick Puppies NGO. The Let's Not Kick Puppies NGO receives $20 million from the government, which is led by this politician, what a shocker! The politician himself sits on the board of directors of the Don't Kick Puppies NGO, and they spend 60% of their income on administrative overhead fees. But when confronted with this, the politician, concerned about his reputation, buries the evidence. Right. He orders a political assassination, smears his opponent, smears the people accusing him of this as being like politically motivated or some nasty slur term. Second politician, his concern is with honor. And so he refuses to give money to a certain NGO because his cousin's on the board of directors, and he worries it would be an immoral deed, right?
Yeah.
The second type of person is in a real honor-shame culture where you would rather die than commit a misdeed. The second type of person is the one who commits seppuku. He would rather die than live dishonorably. The real warrior code. Whereas the first person will die to save his face. That's I guess my least useful but favorite definition of fairies. Fairies are what is. They're not there, but they are. Anywho, that's I guess four features associated with fairies. We have 7. Fifth is, I mentioned, very mischievous. Obviously.
Oh yes.
Yes, exceedingly so. Obviously, some of the ones where the mischief goes south are the ones that have been passed down through posterity. But in practical terms, you will often find that it's every variety of prank, from changing the color of your horse's mane with dyes to sneaking eggs, raw egg into your food, or tying your hair in weird shapes, going on a joint.
Poking you at night.
Yeah, I should have looked up its name. There's a Luxembourgish fairy who, like, its only goal in life is to just show up at 3 a.m. in the morning, riding on a whirlwind, and punch you in the face. That's all it just at 3 o'clock in the morning, you're just sleeping, and this very hairy, very irate fairy comes riding in on a whirlwind, punches you, and leaves. No other reason for being. Shows up in no other case. That's just it. Just like, no sleep for you. Whack.
So I think there are more well-known examples where they might invite you to one of their dances, and you dance the whole night long, and it feels like it's only been 5 minutes. Your pocket's getting filled with coin, and then when you return home, you dig into your pockets and find only like the horse crap.
Yeah, horse crap. Yeah, lots of stuff involving horse crap, seaweed, feeding human beings mud, aggressively pretending to be something they're not for the purposes of poking fun at you. Yeah. I think last time I told the example of it was a poltergeist encounter in, I want to say, 18th century England. May have been 19th century, but I think 18th. Haunting a deacon's house, funnily enough. And they asked him, was he a demon? And usually in poltergeist encounters, the poltergeist doesn't speak. In this case, he said he was a demon, but their attempts to pray him away wouldn't work. Because he was a pious Christian demon who was personally friends with Jesus. And then he proceeded to punch the deacon and the F in the face and outboxed over a dozen exorcists before people gave up. Like, they were all going after this because it's like they brought in four clerical exorcists, and then at the time they thought executioners had magic powers, so they brought executioners in. They couldn't get rid of him either. I don't know. Like, that is very clearly not a demonic encounter.
No.
One of the things that always marks the difference between demons and not demons is, does prayer work? If you're praying and it ain't going away, it's probably not a demonic. At least as far as the folklore is concerned.
That's something Gerald of Wales noted.
Yeah.
That sacraments were useless in application towards, like, household boogies.
Yeah.
Because they just throw dirt on you.
Yeah, throw dirt on you. Not the only time I've seen that. There was another one in France. This would have been about the same time, but that one was would only violently assault you if you were Catholic. And then there was the famous example. There was John Wesley's poltergeist, who would John Wesley trained it to do musical duets with him by tapping, and they would have. I love John Wesley. They would have put on musical performances together, and his family concluded that they didn't know if it was a demon or an angel, but they were certain enough that it was a staunch Jacobite because it could not tolerate any prayers to the king. You Jacobites by name, lend an ear, said the fairy. But yeah, very mischievous. You can even see like that, all those examples I just listed. Mischievous, usually in an innocent sense, obviously, sometimes not in an innocent sense. But yeah, usually in an innocent sense, very child. As I mentioned last week, there is a very good reason that fairies get associated with children. Right? They share many of the same childlike qualities. And not that I think this is relevant, but G.K. Chesterton also pointed out that the concern over honor is in many respects childlike too. Children are more, I believe he said, children are more just than adults because adults know how much more they have sinned. Adults don't want children want justice more. I'm not quoting him well. But yeah, it's an observation that children tend to be more honor-bound than adults. Whereas adults want mercy. Which is a double-edged sword, right?
Yeah.
That's Article 5. Article 6, love, music, and dance. Certainly the stories that are best well known with fairies are like Tommy was wandering the moors, and then he saw 12 men in little caps and boots dancing a circle around some mushrooms. Right?
Yeah.
It's like half of old fairy stories. At least by sheer number. Music, dancing, feasts, very consistent feature of fairy encounters. And will often invite human beings to join them. And then lastly, the last of the 7 features that we can positively associate with fairies are their positive association with a given place or object. There are certainly exceptions to this, so this is the least, I won't say it's the least important, but it's probably the one on this list you're most likely to find violated. But as a general rule, fairies tend to be associated with a very specific feature, not necessarily a feature of the natural world, because they will be associated with human habitations or places that humans are. The domovoi / brownie / hobgoblin / whatever else people wanted, which is the house fairy. And then you got stuff like the bannock, which was the Russian bathhouse fairy. Its job was to sit there in the bathhouse and guard it. There's a famous story recorded in Linda J. Ivanit's Russian folk belief, where a fairy wrestled Satan, or a bannock wrestled Satan himself because Satan tried to steal 2 girls who were in the bathroom or bathhouse. And yeah, so the bannock was incensed and wrestled Satan. So, thank you, bannock. Otherwise, yeah, associated with natural features, you have the fairies of the woodland, such as the Leshy, fairies of bodies of water, such as the Naiad, Dryad, etc., and fairies of mountains or mounds, or specific set of old ruins, very place-bound beings.
Yeah.
And then I think, yes, the 7 articles of Fairyland, fairy lore.
Woohoo!
Woo! We did it. Positive view on fairies. Given. And then I guess we would like to close this discussion. There'll be another 10 or 20 minutes for those who are about to log out with a discussion of how to approach a fairy.
Yeah.
This tends to show up a lot. There's a lot of, if you look this up, you'll find a lot of really crappy advice, especially from New Age circles, eh? It's a being of light / nature spirit, and people are like, rub your feet with moss and dance nude in the woods. Like, don't do that. don't do that. All the stuff involving like ancient or creature of light, like that's not a fairy.
No.
Best case scenario, that's an angel, they're light being. Worst case scenario, it's something masking itself as a being of light. Because just because it appears bright does not mean it is bright. But yeah, would you want to start with the discussion of how to approach a fairy? Right.
I guess.
I mean, thing number one.
What?
Clean your room.
Yeah, clean your room. Yeah.
Challenge your inner Peters. Clean your room, young man. Sorry, I'm not a good impersonator. Yeah, clean your room.
You need to be more Kermit-like. Yeah, no. Well, that's a real value. That's a very fairy value. Like, clean your room, keep your space tidy, for the sake of invitation. I guess before really interacting with it, I think you need to have some awareness that it's actually on your land.
Yeah.
So if you suspect, I mean, it might show up and might actually, knock on your door. Could come in other forms too. I guess when you're talking about approaching it, it's also like how to retain a relationship. And I think, from all the things we've listed, keep your dues. Don't be overly malicious to the fairy, or don't be violent to it, because that'll either kick it off your land, or it might come back with a vengeance.
Yeah.
Don't be violent. I think it's what would be actually helpful is establishing like trade, like exchange of goods, because they do like that.
Yeah. Well, courtesy, generosity of conduct. We used to call magnanimity in the West.
Yeah.
This is the sort of we call benevolent propriety in Chinese. The gentleman, in the words of Zhenji, the gentleman is easygoing, but upholds justice. Right?
Mm-hmm.
He speaks with honor to his inferiors as much as to his superiors. I mean, most of this is general life advice, right? But yeah, behave with courtesy, respect. This doesn't just include if you see the thing. This also includes to your natural environment.
And to other people as well.
And other people, other people, your house. Much of this is what you should be doing if you're a monotheist already, right?
Yes.
Like treat within what is outside you lies the image of God, and the creation of God. Treat it with respect.
Yeah, as Leviticus and Jesus say, love thy neighbor as yourself. That actually is actually very important. Yeah,
where Ryan is going to come back to discuss land in the Bible at some point, not tonight, but at some point in the maybe distant future. And let's just say that love your neighbor as thyself is not simply an ethic for humans; it's an ethic for the soil.
Yes.
In the Bible. The Bible has a very definite view of reverence to the creation as a article of the creator.
Mhm.
So yeah, behave with respect, behave with courtesy, in a general and not just a specific sense. Keep your dues. Follow thy word. This is, I mean, all of this is moral advice you should be doing anyways. And leave dishes of milk out.
Yes.
That's basically it.
Yeah, and you
Don't
know, remember to invite the fairy in for some rollicking good times.
yes, invite him for dinner.
Yeah,
But yeah,
but
no. Oh, sorry. You don't need to bow or set up an altar
no.
or do anything.
Yeah, you don't need to
Unless,
worship it.
yeah, no, don't need to worship. Like much like other human beings, do not need to proffer up your soul or engage in weird deeds with a goat.
No need for
In
human sacrifice.
Yeah, no human sacrifice. That was a reference to the some Dominican records for the.
Oh,
Yeah, it's they offer themselves up to Satan in the form of a goat. It's like, and where'd you get that one, sir? Oh, Dominicans. Oh, Dominic. For the record, they said that about everything. Like, it's this exact, so the stuff you get associated with quote unquote witchcraft. Not that witchcraft isn't real, but in a specifically Dominican context, is stuff that the Dominican order associated with lepers, Jews, Muslims, Gnostics, the Chinese, random like pagans. It's a remarkably identical set, like Aztecs. It's a remarkably identical set of values consistently applied to a bunch of people who never did any of it. They all strip nude. It's like, okay. It's mostly
though, a lot of modern adherents, or like modern occultists and pagans will be like, so we should do that. It's a sign of empowerment.
yeah. It's got, thank you Victorian romantics for picking that up as something that people actually did rather than recognizing it was obvious rot. Charles Godfrey Leland is the chief culprit for that particular pile of nonsense. But yeah, do not strip naked. Right? Do not set up an altar. Do not. I don't know what else I can list of things not to do. Do not pass your child through the fires of Moloch.
Yeah, no sacrifice, no don't invoke them as ancestors, please God.
Yeah. I mean, if you want to have a real fun time.
Like
Like, I suspect it might work, it just might go horribly. Because then they're not coming as fairies, they're coming as your ancestors, right?
Oh, that'd be hilarious.
Yeah. Well, there's all those really weird like ones where it's like the giant occasional stories that came out of Japan and China of giant catfish randomly showing up to harass you. The Japanese snake spirits that used to give you advice on washing your clothing properly. But yeah, that aside, I think that's about it. Right? Behave respectfully, behave honorably, keep your word. There's a real lesson to be learned here for the records about the relationship between truth And like honesty is not simply a question of saying what you believe to be the truth. It is also a lived commitment to A, investigate, and B, adhere to that truth, right? Truthfulness or faithfulness, or not, like truthfulness and faithfulness are not distinct notions, they're interrelated notions. We adhere to the truth when we keep faith.
Yeah.
This isn't just an idea you find in Paul. But yeah, with that in mind, unless there's anything else you wanted to talk about, Ryan, I think we can call it here.
Yeah, no, I think that sums it up quite nicely.
Beautiful. So we will, yeah, try not to get punched by the morning whirlwind fairies. No, that's not, you have to punch back. Punch the fairy. If he shows up to punch you, punch him. Go, come out, you black and tans, come out and fight me like a man. Right in the fair, right in his noggin. That it will be mostly it for tonight. I will try and stream Sunday, maybe Saturday too, because my job is, yeah, let's not get into that. My job. I'm not too sure what we'll be talking about. If Hound, who's in chat right now, is willing to join me, we might go into epistemology and character. If not, I will come up with some other topic. And the only other thing, I guess, to close this off with a little announcement, I've spoken before on this channel about my desire to launch a series quizzing individuals about areas that might be peripheral or not as well known about their interests, in order to broaden the number of issues people think about and the way people think about the world by opening up another aspect, as Wittgenstein would call it. I have gotten my very first speaker in 3 weeks. He will be presenting modern occult theories on technology, amateur magus. If anyone else is involved, by all means, contact me and we can start setting stuff up. But I am Wild Philosopher. He was Ryan Rose. Fairies are real, and thank you very much for joining us. Have a wonderful evening.
May the fairies bless you.
May the fairies bless you.